Hello, everyone. It's May 31st. You're listening to Scott Rusterholtz with today's edition of the Listen and Learn podcast. As always, thanks for listening. If you enjoy our videos, a reminder to please subscribe to our channel. That way you're aware of videos every time we release them. Please also share them with your friends if you think they too might be interested. Today, we're going to focus on two main stories, one that's gotten a lot of attention and one, frankly, that I don't think has gotten enough attention. First one is the Paris climate deal and the apparent announcement that Trump will be exiting the agreement. This was a campaign promise that he made repeatedly throughout the trail, and after discussing it with internal advisors and foreign leaders, it appears that sometime this week he'll be announcing an exit. There are two different ways to exit the agreement, which we'll get to in a minute, but first, just a primer on what the Paris Agreement is. So it was signed by the Obama administration. It's not a treaty because it never went to the Senate, which is why Trump can unilaterally exit the agreement. And it was a voluntary agreement aimed at slowing climate change. And my big problem with it, and the reason why I think the right thing to do is to exit it, is that it's voluntary. So essentially, it's an agreement of 193 countries that say they all want to stop the rise of temperatures to no more than 2 degrees Celsius from a current scientific expectation of an increase of 2.7 to 3.7 degrees. So we're trying to slow the rise in temperatures 0.7 to 1.7 degrees. And then if this voluntary deal works really well, the parties agree to try even harder to get to 1.5 degrees. So the actual text says, and I'm quoting here, that the agreement, quote, invites parties to communicate their first nationally determined contribution no later than when the party submits its respective instrument of ratification, accession, or approval, end quote. So each country will communicate how much it's going to cut voluntarily its carbon emissions. And then there will be, quote, an ad hoc working group, end quote, that's going to monitor each nation's progress along the trajectory that they themselves set forth. However, the deal merely signifies, quote, a voluntary participation authorized by each party involved, end quote. So put this in a layman's terms, countries set forth their own targets aimed again at keeping climate change at no more than 2 degrees increase Celsius, and then they will voluntarily adhere to those targets. Now, what happens if they don't do what they voluntarily say? Are there any enforcement mechanisms whatsoever? No, there are not. So the developed world says we're going to cut emissions, the US 26%. The developing world says we're going to raise emissions by less than we otherwise would. But if we don't, no skin off our back. At the same time, the deal agrees that we're going to have developed nations give developing ones $100 billion per year by 2020 to help fund their development. So we're now making income redistribution a global affair. And you have to ask yourself, how is it that we can't even get Germany to give the $4 billion on defense spending it needs to meet its NATO requirement, yet we're going to start giving developing countries $100 billion per year? It's borders on insane, in my opinion. But again, I cannot emphasize enough, it's non-binding and there's no enforcement. So what that means is, inevitably what happen is the US is going to say, we committed 26%, we're a country of our word, we're cutting emissions by 26%, which essentially means we're going to have to make fuel more expensive, incentivize renewables, probably make manufacturing, all else equal, less competitive than it otherwise would be. Meanwhile, China is going to say, you know what? We're not going to end up doing quite as much as we said we're going to do. Too bad, there's no enforcement mechanism. Suddenly, China's in violation of the Paris Agreement, but there's nothing you can do about it. Its manufacturing sector is now artificially competitive to the US. Manufacturing jobs leave to China. So essentially, you have this whole trust system with countries that have historically proven they're unworthy of trust. So if this was an agreement that had enforcement mechanisms, i.e., if you don't hit the targets that are set forth by everyone, not just yourself, but everyone agrees to targets, if you don't hit them, guess what? Everyone puts a tariff on you approved by the WTO to equalize that. That would be one thing, so at least that would ensure fairness. But here you don't even have that. So you have a situation where we may start hurting our competitive relative to everyone else because we've agreed to an agreement that other people aren't following. And that's simply illogical. And the question you're then left with is, how come so many big companies from Exxon to Apple were lobbying the president in favor of this if it was going to make America less competitive? I think the answer is twofold. First, companies like Apple are multinational. They don't particularly care where they produce goods so long as they're able to produce them. So if America is less competitive than China, they don't care because they can just move their manufacturing to China and continue to sell goods at a very attractive level. And in fact, it makes it easier for them than small national companies can't compete, who are stuck in a developing world that is adhering to standards the developing world is not. And then, big companies, generally speaking, like more regulations because they're barriers to entry that make it harder for new competitors to emerge. Look, under Obama, the EPA has added 4,000 regulations, many of them under the Paris Agreement, or under the guise of complying with this agreement. So it just makes it easier and easier for big companies. So again, we are exiting an unenforced, non-binding deal, which makes sense because we can't be in a situation where we are artificially making it harder for ourselves to compete when the rest of the world is not. Unless we can get some kind of binding deals, there's no reason for us to be a party to it. Now, ironically, you can only exit the deal in 3 years' notice. So that's one way Trump can exit it. Now, it technically doesn't matter because, again, it's voluntary. So if we don't meet our own requirements over the next 3 years, there's no punishment. So we might as well just do the 3-year exit. Conversely, we could exit the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which would instantly exit us from the Paris Agreement. There's no ramifications to us doing that, since the only other agreement reached in this framework was the Kyoto Protocol, which we never even ratified, so we're not a member of that really anyway, so it'd be no skin off our back either way. I'm agnostic. I think it really doesn't matter which way Trump decides to remove us from the Paris Agreement. The big thing is to ensure that we don't start making it harder to manufacture goods here than it is the rest of the world. But that's just a backwards policy. So this was a real step by the Trump administration to say, we're going to put our national interests first. We're going to protect American production. We're going to protect American workers. This is a major move, and look forward to the formal announcement in the coming days. Finally, the other story I just want to mention, as you saw yesterday, 90 people were killed overnight in a suicide bombing in Afghanistan. And what I just really want to say is we're not spending enough time talking about the war in Afghanistan. The U.S. currently has 8,400 troops there. NATO has another 5,000, but again, you're kind of left scratching your head on how in a 28-member coalition, the U.S. is 60% of the troops. It speaks to the unfair burden sharing. The U.S. may be adding another 3,000 troops. 4 U.S. troops have died this year. 2,400 in total have died in Afghanistan. And this war versus the war in Iraq has been chronically undercovered. You continue to have 3,500 civilians killed each year in Afghanistan, primarily by anti-government forces. Taliban now controls a third of the country. That is slightly more than a year ago. There are 1,000 ISIS fighters in Afghanistan, which is why, if you remember a few weeks ago, we dropped the quote-unquote mother of all bombs to eliminate an ISIS tunnel network. But you really risk that Afghanistan continues to be a stalemate. If anything, the Taliban has gained a little bit of ground, and there's no end in sight to this perma war. And we really have to start asking, what is it that we're trying to achieve there, and how achievable is it? Because the one thing we certainly don't want is going back to a pre-2001 equilibrium where you have terrorist organizations that have free rein and are able to attune and practice their skills so that they can wreak havoc on the West. But we can't also just have an endless U.S. presence. So yesterday's horrible suicide bombing is a reminder that the terrorist threat in Afghanistan is still quite large. The Taliban is still a very potent force. And we really need to rethink as a country what our strategy is. And frankly, as a citizenry and as a media, we need to start reporting and focusing on this because you have thousands of American troops in harm's way. You have essentially still a failed state after a 16-year war and a couple $1 trillion. And we need a grand rethink on what it is we're trying to do in Afghanistan and what our go-forward strategy is. Because the status quo of a perma stalemate with Taliban and a perma U.S. troop presence isn't sustainable. So those are really the two big stories of the day. Thank you, as always, for listening. And if you enjoyed these podcasts, please subscribe to our channel. Please share our videos with friends. You can also follow us on Facebook at the Listen and Learn Podcast and follow me on Twitter at Read and Learn. Have a great day, everyone.